He's a bully, and he loves humiliating people. There's stories of him pulling zips down of a woman in at parties, and anything to embarrass and humiliate people, knowing that people can't respond to it. It's someone who's been so entitled and so used to behaving exactly as he wants and getting away with it, that he doesn't even think through the consequences of actions. You put the blame on Andrew, but Andrew was enabled and protected by various institutions and individuals, from his staff to politicians to diplomats to civil servants. Anything to do with the royals is either taken out of material, or those files are just sent to Windsor and kind of lost. And this is censoring history. This is actually destroying the historical narrative. It would lead to, a lot of embarrassment. Who were the people who, for example, sanctioned a lot of his activities? They sanctioned the use of private jets instead of commercial airlines, or helicopters instead of cars. I know that King Charles was against it. It seems to me Peter Mandelson and Tony Blair were people who very much pushed for the appointment. Well, one has to ask why.
Welcome back to Democracy for Sale, and today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by historian and author Andrew Lownie. Andrew's the author of a really important book called Entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, and explores the life of Prince Andrew, well, as he was known, Prince Andrew, and this whole culture of privilege, secrecy and impunity that surrounds the royal family. And over the course of the next half hour or so, we'll be talking about some of the obstacles Andrew faced in writing this book, what this story tells about how power and secrecy works in modern Britain. And we're going to be talking about Andrew himself, and Andrew and his relationship with people like Jeffrey Epstein, and how the kind of British institutions really served to protect him. I'm really, really excited to be having this conversation. Andrew's royal titles have been removed. Are you surprised by what you've seen in the months since you published your book?
Yes, the reaction has been fantastic. I hope that perhaps by bringing together all the information on Andrew into one place, some people suddenly realised how awful he and indeed Sarah Ferguson have behaved in the way they've monetised their position in the royal family for their own personal gain. But I think one of the really gratifying things is it's emboldened, I think, the press to be slightly more critical of the royal family. And so we've seen a sort of drip feed of articles, particularly the leaked emails from the Mail on Sunday. And I think it's kind of softened up the position. Public opinion has been sort of dragged along with that, particularly when they see, for example, Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew at Duchess of Kent's funeral, and see how shameless they are, the way they behave. And then, of course, the publication of Virginia Giuffre's own book, I kind of humanized the whole sort of sordidness of the whole story. Though, my book was very much focused on the financial shenanigans. So, yeah, I am encouraged. It seems to me even that royal writers who in the past I thought were pretty timid and were reluctant to I suppose, lose their access to the royal rota or the royal family are a little bit more bullish now. So there's been a bit of a sea change. I was surprised by the decision last Thursday to strip him of his titles properly, which is what they should have done years ago, and to get him out of Royal Lodge. So that's a sign that they realise how serious a problem this is. It was clearly, there were wider questions being asked about royal privilege and accountability, and they didn't really want to go there. And in some ways, they brought this crisis on themselves, because if they had dealt with it ruthlessly and decisively in 2019, 2020, 2022, there were lots and lots of points. Even, frankly, a few weeks ago, when Andrew was allowed to make his own statement and still deny the allegations and claim that he had stood down voluntarily, if they'd made the statement they made last week, 2 weeks ago, I think that might have, wouldn't say assuaged the public, but it might have actually stopped the further questioning of the, shall we say, how rotten the state of Denmark was. But as you know, both of us have been campaigning for years to have more royal accountability and transparency, particularly about finances, but also their records. So I think this is a welcome stage. And actually, ironically, Andrew may well have saved the monarchy. He may have forced them to modernise when they might have been perhaps a bit more reluctant to do so.
Your book is, it's, and we'll talk a bit more about some of the specifics of things that come out of your books. I think it's so remarkable just going through it that every page has got at least a 5-figure number of money being given by somebody to either Sarah Ferguson or Andrew Windsor. It's quite remarkable, the amount of money. You're talking about millions, sometimes, Kazakh billionaires giving him huge amounts of money. But the one thing that kind of struck me was actually some of the stuff in the first pages of the book, because, just how difficult this was a book to write. You said you contacted over 3,000 people. Less than a tenth of them responded to you. And not just that, you wrote hundreds of freedom of information requests because Andrew, for a long time, was a UK trade representative. He had an official government role. He was effectively working for us, the public. So we should have access to information about it. And you were blank. You basically were filibustered and blanked for all of that for years.
Yeah. I mean, I think, we put the blame on Andrew, but Andrew was enabled and protected by various institutions and individuals, from his staff to politicians to diplomats to civil servants. And I think they have to take some responsibility for covering up for him. I mean, indeed, protected by the Queen. When complaints were brought to her, she just sort of sent the people away with a flea in their ear. But I did have difficulties, official difficulties. The Foreign Office told ambassadors not to talk to me. As you say, I put in these FOI requests for information about who accompanied him on these trips, who he saw, what business was done. And these files, which stretch from 2001 to 2011, should by law be in the Public Records Office. He is a taxpayer-funded civil servant, and they found used every exemption under FOI to prevent me seeing them. Everything from vexatious to Section 12, that it was too difficult. When I narrowed the request, they then claimed they had nothing. They were often contradictory. They would say they had nothing, and then when I put in for a particular period, when I put in another request the same period just to check, they would say they had it. Lots and lots of use of semantics, as always. They hid behind national security, personal data, health and safety, you name it. So I think one of the things I'd really like to get out of this is Parliament to make sure that both the Foreign Office and Department of Trade release all their files into the public archive, so we can see exactly what was going on. And if there's nothing to worry about, they should have no concerns. And of course, there will have to be some redactions just because of the nature of some of those exemptions. But I think at the moment, nothing has been released. I mean, one thing I did get them to acknowledge was that all files on Prince Andrew would be closed until 2065, which is, of course, we'll all be dead by then, probably. This is something that I've been very concerned about for a long time. The fact that basically anything to do with the royals is either taken out of material, or those files are just sent to Windsor and kind of lost, or Buckingham Palace. And talking to sensitivity reviewers, they all talk about piles of things in Buckingham Palace waiting to be checked, or indeed just files being destroyed. Because one of the shocking things is the number of files in all the government departments which are destroyed without any record publicly being kept of what has actually gone. And I saw this when I did my book on Traitor King on Edward VIII. There's only one representative file of the surveillance that was done by MI5 and the Met on Wallace Simpson. The rest was destroyed. It was kept until 2005, from 1935. And yet here we are in a world where everything can be digitalized. There's no problems of storage. And yet we're getting rid of pieces of historical evidence for some sort of administrative reason, or perhaps because people don't want this stuff out. And time and time I found that, again with Traitor King. I found mirror copies of the Colonial Office files for the Duke of Windsor in the Bahamas, but actually if you go to the Colonial Office files, they've more or less all been weeded and destroyed. And this is censoring history. This is actually destroying the historical narrative.
And as you say, history, but also in some ways the present day. These are not, these are historical events that's very much, I'm not saying it would be okay if it was just history, but these are deeply political decisions as well on one level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, clearly, this again would, with Prince Andrew, who's my first living subject, I mean, clearly it would lead to, a lot of embarrassment. Who were the people who, for example, sanctioned a lot of his activities? They sanctioned the use of private jets instead of commercial airlines, or helicopters instead of cars. And it's still not entirely clear who basically appointed him to this role, and the terms of the role, and whether, for example, one could come after him for misconduct in public office by the nature of the appointment. I know that King Charles was against it. It seems to me Peter Mandelson and Tony Blair were people who very much pushed for the appointment. Well, one has to ask why, given he was a very unsuccessful naval officer, and why they haven't come forward and talked about it now. And one of the things I found, I mean, you're absolutely right. I got about 300 people to talk to me, only about 10%. But that's probably about 10 times as many people as normally will go on the record in a royal book. So that was a bit of a breakthrough. And the fact that they were prepared to be named, and more will be named in an update of the book, is encouraging. I think people sort of realize that. But again, the ambassadors in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan know exactly what he was up to there. They've refused to talk to me. I just get, nice try. But, I think a parliamentary inquiry into his time as a trade envoy would be very useful. In fact, some ways more useful than looking at the Crown Estate arrangements for Royal Lodge. Because on oath, they might actually have to say exactly what he was doing.
It's really striking. At one point, you quote from a US diplomatic cable describes Andrew railing against anti-corruption investigators. I think he says something like, Britain's trying to win the new great game. And I think it just shows, this was somebody who was out in the world dealing with people like the Kazakhs, the Azerbaijani regime, regimes both with awful human rights records, oligarchic regimes, and people who seem to have been giving him money as well.
Yes, I mean, the places where he was most active for himself and indeed possibly for the government were places like North Africa, Libya, the Middle East, and the Central Asian republics. And it was a sort of Wild West, particularly in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. Lots of opportunities there for oil and gas and minerals. We clearly, it was like the great game. I can see that. One doesn't want to be completely naive about it, but these were pretty oppressive regimes, all of them. And he was kind of paying lip service to them. And in some ways, it's these dodgy regimes who are the ones most likely to basically be open to corruption and to giving him a bung for introductions and contacts he can make or appearing at events. I think sadly the whole thing is become a family business. So we now have his daughters appearing, promoting Saudi banks, involved with Middle Eastern charities, and always quite clear, if they might have been paid to do some of this. And we've seen several court cases where money has been paid to the family, both the children and the parents, which they can't explain and doesn't have any rational basis to it. So, they've never really spoken, any of them, about their money-making activities. Maybe it's time they did another Newsnight interview. There's so much we just don't know.
Well, did it?
Yeah, no, it didn't. Exactly. Maybe better on Loose Woman. But, there's just so much we don't know. And this, of course, raises all the questions about the opaqueness of royal finances, of the Duchy of Lancaster and Cornwall. So there are lots of things, I think could be done. The unsealing of royal wills, a royal register, actually having parliamentary scrutiny and actually getting rid of that Erskine May rule that there isn't. Just so many things that could be done. Getting rid of their exemptions under the Freedom of Information Act. I can't remember a single instance where Section 37 where it hasn't been used if the royals are mentioned.
I think and it strikes me as well, when I was reading your book, there's a couple of things that really jumped out at me. One was, you talk about how Andrew effectively became a trophy asset for billionaires. And it reminded me of reading Oliver Bullow's last book, The Butler to the World. This idea that Britain effectively, is kind of sells itself and sells reputations to the rich and powerful of the world. And it feels like Andrew really that's effectively what the royal Andrew was doing in other aspects. He wasn't the only one in the royal family. That is something that we've basically been selling.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And the other, clearly Sarah Ferguson was doing that. It's clearly what the daughters were doing. There are other figures. Prince Michael's been caught trying to do things in Russia. There are questions around Zara Phillips and Peter Phillips in places like Hong Kong with Johnny Hon, who's a sort of Hong Kong businessman who's kind of cozied up to the royals and pays them large sums of money for roles which are a little unclear. So, yeah, it is a wider problem than Andrew. Andrew and Sarah Ferguson are the most egregious examples. But I think once the veil is drawn back and we begin to pick at the ball of wool, the whole thing will begin to unravel a bit.
And do you think that on the back of, because you start your book by talking about, not just a challenge of getting people to talk, but actually, you're talking about these world policed by lawyers and PR people, staff have signed NDAs, even at one point, really surprising that there was some sort of attempt at taking out legal action against you around some of this stuff. Could you speak to that it felt like what you were trying to get into was this intentionally, not just by the nature of our laws and lack of transparency and regulation around the royal family, but also their ability to use a kind of enabling industry to protect themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So we certainly my publishers got legal letters from Sarah Ferguson's lawyers before the book was published, and in attempts really to intimidate us. Not just that they were looking at the book, but they were monitoring, for example, my social media, and they wouldn't hesitate to act. I mean, nothing has happened so far. I mean, the book clearly was very, very heavily legaled, and there's a lot more I could have put, unfortunately, which I wasn't allowed to. But yeah, this is, I have to say, a long-standing campaign that I've certainly experienced in trying to do the books I write. In effect, I had a slaps against me when I tried to ensure that the Mountbatten diaries and letters, which have been bought with public money, should be made available as was expected. But for example, I know there's been a PR campaign against the book, with a PR firm paid to do so, with trolls, people spreading false rumors about me. I like young girls. I go to prostitutes. Can't remember all the other ones, but negative reviews, negative ratings on Amazon. We found people have tried to put, I don't know how they do this, but tried to put on 5-star reviews on Amazon. Amazon have refused to accept them. Journalists or friends of mine have said that the word went round not to deal with the book if they wanted, basically to stay in with the royal family.
And that's a huge, this access to the royals has been a big way of how they've manipulated, I think actually I'm going to say the word manipulated the media.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they use pressure and patronage. So quite a lot of the people that I would have quite liked to talk to, for example, like William Hague, wouldn't talk to me because he's now got some position with the Prince and Princess of Wales. And that's, you find, lots of them sort of, the ones who are nice and give them a lovely, generous sovereign grant suddenly become orders of the merit, or get the order of merit or something. It's all a very cozy arrangement, and it is carrot and sticks. But you're absolutely right. Access is a big factor. I mean, that was, I think one of the shocking things for me was the way that ABC Television, who had the story on Geoffrey and Andrew, years before it broke, wouldn't let Amy Robach run it because they were worried about getting access to members of the royal family. And we see this in the States at the moment. I mean, everyone is kowtowing to Trump. My own publishers took out a sentence on Trump and Melania because they were worried about, in effect, a slap. Not that it wasn't true, but they just couldn't face the hassle of dealing with Trump and the expense of it. So there's a lot of pressure still being put on publishers and writers to kind of self-censor, or not to put stuff in. So it is pretty frightening. And I was just very lucky that I have a pretty robust publisher and editor who I think share our view that there has to be more openness. And as monarchists, I think that's much better. The monarchy only survives on the basis of public trust and respect. And if they feel members of the royal family have got their noses in the trough, then that's going to pretty much undermine the whole institution.
It's interesting what you say about Trump and Melania, because the book does deal with in detail as well with what's precipitated what we are now, which is Jeffrey Epstein, and Andrew's relationship with a paedophile, and Trump's relationship with Epstein is part of that too. When you did you know as much as you knew when you started doing this research, or were you even surprised by what you found out when you started researching that relationship between Epstein and Andrew?
Oh, I mean, I kind of been reading it in the news reports, but I hadn't, to be honest, been following it that closely. Yeah, I was. I mean, not only did it begin much earlier than they've all claimed, it lasted much longer. And time and time again, I think what I found was that we assumed that Andrew was telling the truth in the Newsnight interview and Sarah Ferguson in various interviews, and actually you then find that they were both of them lying through their teeth, and they've been caught out now with the leaked emails. Also, as the leaked emails and various things come out, you begin to see how this whole thing operated. So, for example, Sarah Ferguson was caught in a sting operation by the News of the World in May 2010, selling access to Andrew for £500,000. And then you see how the whole sort of symbiotic relationship between the press and the royal family works. She goes on Oprah a few weeks later and basically says that was Sarah. I don't know what came over her. She's a nice, good girl now. It's not going to happen again. And how the press have kind of supported them. And I've seen it time and time again, the way the Sun is very supportive of Sarah Ferguson. It wouldn't write anything critical about her. Certain papers where the proprietors or the editors are friendly with members of the royal family, won't do anything critical, or it's pretty, they pull their punches. And of course, the royal family are very clever. They brought in Tobin Andre, who was in the Mail, to act as a press secretary. They cozy up. Fergie had lots of charities she did with particular papers like The Sun, the Daily Express, in order to keep them on side. And maybe that's inevitable. That's the job of a good PR firm. But it does mean that we have this, I would say, slightly skewered system. And it's very interesting. I talked to the Foreign Press Association, who kind of feel cut out from all that, much more likely to report accurately in the way that they have in the past. I mean, the coverage of the abdication crisis was much fuller, clearly, in the States and even Australia. And that's, when one does research, one often has to go to those places to actually get the proper coverage. So, I mean, there are lots and lots of things, and there is quite a lot of resentment building up in the media towards the royal family. And I think what also struck me is going around talking at festivals around the country, which are normally in Middle England and attended by retired colonels. They all feel very strongly that what's going on is absolutely wrong, and the royal family needs to get their house in order.
Yeah, there's something, I think, in your book kind of narrates a kind of world in which there's so little transparency, there's so much secrecy, there's so much money, and there's so much access for sale, and effectively these people who are supposed to be the kind of custodians, the monarchy in some respects, the custodians of the national interest, looking out for for the public. It feels like they're incredible. It feels like it's completely the opposite. And there's some aspects actually to just Andrew's character. There's one segment in the book which isn't about. It's not about money. There's so many bits about money that are just jaw dropping. But he's at a kind of fancy dinner, and he's sitting next to some lady at a fancy dinner, and a pâté arrives, and he says, "Oh, I don't like the smell of that, and you should sniff it." And she kind of leans over to smell it, and he pushes her face in it, and it just that just in some ways you read that and you're like, wow, this is not the behavior. This is the behavior of people who are used to unaccountable power.
Yes, absolutely. He's a bully, and he loves humiliating people. There's stories of him pulling zips down of women in at parties and taking away place servings and things like that. Anything to embarrass and humiliate people, knowing that people can't respond to it. And it is absolutely an abuse of power. But yeah, it is. It's someone who's been so entitled and so used to behaving exactly as he wants and getting away with it, that he doesn't even think through the consequences of actions, and can't think. It's just a sort of funny joke, which amuses him. It is. There were time and time again there were these extraordinary episodes where he takes advantage of his position.
And Andrew, I just want to talk a bit more about the work you've done more broadly. I think it's a fascinating kind of body of work you've produced. You've written about Cambridge spies, you've written about the abdication crisis, you've written about now Prince Andrew, and Mountbatten. Your work on Mountbatten. I know from talking to you, I don't think I'm breaking any confidences, that one of the reasons the book on Andrew partly came out of ridiculous legal costs that you had to run up trying to fight for transparency about Mountbatten. Do you want to talk about that for a moment?
Yes, well, I mean, the situation with Mountbatten is that I knew that basically the taxpayer had paid up to about £5 million for the private diaries and letters of Louis and Edwina Mountbatten. Now, this is, of course, wonderful stuff for a biographer. It would show the relationship between the two of them. It would show what they were doing in terms of creating chronology. I don't think it was
a very important character, Mountbatten, and his wife, given the relationship with Nehru, the partition of India. A hugely historical and actually contemporary important character, given his relationship with the Queen and Prince Charles, who's now the king.
Yes. I should say something about Mountbatten, who was the last Viceroy of India, Chief of the Defence Staff. He was there during Suez. He was the Chief of Combined Operations during the war. Very close relationship, in fact, as a mentor to several monarchs, from Edward VIII to George VI to the Queen, and indeed a sort of father figure to Charles. So an important figure. But these actually were very much domestic diaries and letters. So it was about just giving flavour to their lives. I don't think there were any state secrets there. So I was shocked to discover that these papers were closed because public money had been raised to make them available. And I went to the Information Commissioner, and he ruled in my favour they should be released. Now, very interestingly enough, the Southampton University, who had them, appeal that decision. They were joined for some strange reason to the Cabinet Office, who claimed there was this mysterious ministerial direction that forced.
So basically, central government got involved in fighting against transparency here.
Exactly. Central government got involved and said there was this mysterious ministerial direction that no one could ever produce that had basically forced Southampton not to release anything. I mean, we're talking about 33,000 pages. Of course, the problem when we came to the appeal is the Information Commissioner basically is a paymaster is the Cabinet Office. And so they really weren't prepared to do any heavy lifting on this. And I decided, I was joined to it, that I would fight it because it was the one opportunity, though my book actually by then had been published, that it was the one opportunity to get this material out, which would be useful to other scholars. And I think it was very unfortunate. I got very good legal representation, but they weren't prepared to do it pro bono. But I was given the view that because, for example, there had been contempt of court by the Cabinet Office in the case, because actually in the end we got 99.9% of the material released, I would have very good grounds to claim my costs, and we'd always stress that. Well, in the end, I didn't get my costs. There was actually a change of judge at the last minute, which, I've always thought was a bit suspicious. And I was hit with £500,000 of costs, had to remortgage my house, sell all my assets, etc. So yes, it did kind of think, well, what's the most commercial book I can do that might help me sort of get back to where I was? So in some ways, it's a sort of poetic justice. I think, but also it's justice for the victims. The fact that, people like Virginia Giuffre and others are now being listened to seriously, and people like Andrew are being held to account. And I think one of the really gratifying things is it has, as I say, emboldened the press to perhaps be a little bit more critical. A lot of these stories, the press then claimed they knew, but just had been too scared to write about. So the more people in some ways who are writing about this, so it doesn't seem like it's just me on a single obsession to bring down, the Duke of York. But if we have lots and lots of people actually saying the same thing as I am, that's great. And, we have had that. There was a very good piece in last week's BBC about this firm Pegasus that Sarah Ferguson was a brand ambassador for. Sunday Times ran a piece last week about the sale of Sunning Hill, the house, and how that was sort of covered up. There's been a lot clearly on the very cozy arrangements for the lease of Royal Lodge. And then clearly all these leaked emails coming from either Ghislaine Maxwell or from the Senate oversight. So, that's great. We are getting a bit more transparency, or people more prepared to fight for transparency than was the case. And I was sort of vilified for this book. How dare you criticize the Queen? This is all made up stuff. This is all gossip, even though pretty much everything I've tried to source when possible. And now to find that, a lot of the stuff has been proved right. I had stuff on Mandelson, for example, and his involvement with Epstein, which was taken out by the publishers. Then, of course, new stuff has come out about that. So that's really pleasing to feel that, one, I got it right, and two, we are getting perhaps a little bit more sort of criticism. Well, people are being a little bit more prepared to investigate, shall we say, this very protected institution.
What's your own personal motivations, I guess? What's brought you to this? You've become, as I say, this chronologer of historically important moments. But I think it's also fair to say of moments that I think cast doubt on some of the stories that Britain tells itself about itself, and particularly the British ruling class tells itself about itself and how it behaves. It's a world which I feel like you do know very well from your own background. Like, how have you ended up in this place?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting, journey in some ways, because, as you say, I come from a, very privileged background. But I think it's because of that. It's actually, I remember even at school feeling a sense of injustice, that people abused their power, whether they were prefects or teachers. And I've always had this my father was a judge, and he had, I think, the very strong sense of fair play. That, for example, the civil service should be independent, that rule of law was independent, and that we had a role also to, yeah, to make the world a slightly, without seeming pompous, a better place, and to use our privilege responsibly, because with privilege comes this desire, and to treat everyone equally. So I think that was one element. I think clearly that the struggles I had, particularly just starting with doing the book on Guy Burgess and finding things being closed there, that's where I think I became very interested in freedom of information, which I hadn't really known about. But how, people are learning that the state lies, that politicians and civil servants lie, that was a bit of an eye-opener for me. As I went on and as people tried to kind of stop me, it kind of encouraged me even more. And I'd always felt that a lot of the stories we hear, history we get, is not really the full picture because of documents that are lost or because rich and powerful people have kind of changed the narrative. And that's always sort of interested me. So increasingly I was drawn to subjects where I thought that, we hadn't got the full story. The royals are one of the obvious places, actually much more secretive than the intelligence services where I had been. So I think that's the journey. And I mean, there's been a price to pay for it. I mean, my mother-in-law won't talk to me now. And lots of friends.
Seriously? Wow.
Seriously, yeah. No, I mean, I'm not going to be spending, any time with her ever again, I suspect.
Is that on the back of the Andrew book or some of?
That's on the back of the Andrew book. Yes, I think that was the final death knell.
Yeah.
But I mean, even funny enough, a lot of my friends who, I started off as I'm not a member of any party now, but I started off as a sort of one nation Tory, was a parliamentary candidate, was very accepting of the sort of establishment, and a member of, smart London clubs and stuff. But, increasingly, maybe I've just grown up. But I am sort of, I wouldn't say ostracized, but I'm certainly cold-shouldered in some of those places, and have had some very difficult conversations with people, who clearly don't buy into what I'm doing. They feel I'm destroying the monarchy, that I've got some agenda. And actually, I always say I'm just a historian trying to tell the story about the past as truthfully as I can.
And I think what comes out in your book is exactly that. I think it comes out in this conversation. It's just how difficult, how many roadblocks are being put up in front of somebody like you to try and do this work. I think it's a huge testimony that you do it.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I mean, it's good that, I feel that there's a sort of brotherhood there. And I think in some ways the sadness isn't the brotherhood, is there are lots of different brothers, and maybe we need to talk more and operate together more. And I think when I certainly talk about freedom of information to people, they're shocked by what they hear. And, it's crucial clearly that we have transparency about, current politics, but I think also just about the past too. And I think what disappoints me is that there aren't more historians. I mean, there are very few, to be honest, who are prepared to stand, to put their head above the parapet and say this is wrong. Particularly historians in Parliament, both the Lords and the Commons, have been absolutely silent on this issue. And I understand they want their access. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you're talking about access, but I mean, one of the interesting ways, for example, the Royal Archives limits access, where of course there's no public inventory of the papers, is, I've found this with some of my own authors working as an agent, is they're just not allowed to go and research there if they don't like the cut of their jib. And they can't do that to me because I've been going there for 40 years, ever since I started writing. I did a book on John Buchan, so they can hardly ban me. But what they do is they ration me. So they'll say, well, the place is booked up until, next summer. So we'll fit you in there. And then when you actually turn up, you find that there hasn't been anyone there for months. So, they have all sorts of levers that they pull just to make your life difficult.
Andrew, thank you so much. It's been so fascinating. I guess the one question I can't but ask is, are you thinking about, I know you mentioned there's going to be maybe a new edition of the Andrew book. Have you other ideas for other areas that you might want to delve into next?
Yes, well, I mean, I'd like to do a sequel to this called Untitled. And I was looking at a book on Prince Philip, who I admire greatly, but I think we haven't had the full story about Prince Philip. And I think that is quite important, particularly his relationship with the Queen. I've been looking at a book, for example, on the Romanovs and the end of the dynasty, and actually whether some of them may have survived. So back to the famous Father and the Tsar book, which, in some ways, you're constantly kind of putting one's reputation on the table. It'd be easy to play things safe. But I kind of quite like just going into dangerous territory and just seeing. I also have, I talk about the historian's sixth sense and instinct. And sometimes you have an instinct that there's more to the narrative than perhaps we've realized. And so changing narratives and changing people's perception of the past is sort of something that interests me.
Andrew, it's been fascinating to talk to you. Thank you so much. It's a terrific book entitled. Deserves all the plaudits it gets. If you get a chance, people should read it. And thank you. Thanks again for joining us.
Always very nice to talk to you, Peter.